And welcome back to Pastor Plek's podcast. I'm your host, Pastor Plek. So glad all of you are joining us as we are recording live from Austin, Texas. And joining me on the show today is none other than Nicole Troup. We are so glad that you are here, Nicole.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
And we're not going to talk about the dating scene for Nicole.
Oh, my goodness.
All right. So also here with me in the studio is James, church planter Foster, former church plant resident here at Wells Branch Community Church, and now positioned to plant Taylor Bible Church.
Coming soon, September 2023. Let's go.
Yeah, so if you are living in Taylor, that is a church where you need to go. And if you didn't know about this church plant, where can they go to find out about it?
TaylorBible.org.
TaylorBible.org. And then also on the show today, a real joy and honor for us. Someone who works with Pastor Officer Grayson in a certain police department near you, none other than Lieutenant Tim Chancellor. How you doing, Tim?
Good, sir.
All right, so Tim, you are joining James Foster in this church plant. Talk to me real quick about how that all came about.
So my wife and I, it was a couple of years ago, we're praying about where would the Lord have us move to so that we could begin to better support our parents as they were starting to age.
Okay.
And as we were looking across Williamson County, as everybody knows, it's just expensive. And so through praying through that decision and asking the Lord to provide, we had an opportunity to purchase some property out southeast of Taylor. Mm-hmm. And that happened right as the Samsung announcement was made that said, hey, we're absolutely coming to Taylor. And so at that time, Mandy and I were attending City View over at Pastor Keith's church and talked to Keith and just said, hey, what's the association's plan for putting a church out there in Taylor? Yeah. And of course, Keith said, well, we're on it. And a couple of months later, he let us know Huddle Bible's going to be planting a church out there and they're going to hire James Foster and go.
Boom.
And so we prayed about it and was asking, is this something we need to be a part of? Because clearly we've moved out here for a reason. What is that? I don't know, but maybe this is part of that plan.
All right. Well, I'm so glad you're here. We're going to put your Bible knowledge to the test today. So see if you really are a qualified elder over there at Taylor Bible Church. So
wow.
This is a lot of pressure on you. Listen, though, millions, and maybe millions of people could be there to judge you at any given moment. So just forewarned is forearmed. We're so glad to have you on the show, and high honor for us as we are really excited about what you do, and thank you for your service.
Yes, sir.
All right, so here's one of the things we're going to be talking about is from Ecclesiastes, chapters 8 through 12. We're going to kind of walk back through that, and what we're talking about was submitting to authority, which Americans in general are just not big fans of.
It's true.
We find a way to unsubmit from something and maybe it's because we submit to our values or something like that. But I feel like that's part of our problem as people. We do a lot of other things, like we're really great on personal relationship with Jesus, whereas maybe some Eastern cultures are not personalized or more corporate everything. Mm-hmm. And so that's probably where the weakness stems from. Is like, when we read Romeo and Juliet, we think of the heroes are Romeo and Juliet and not the families that we're trying to hold up traditional values. So let's walk through this, specifically Ecclesiastes 8, chapter 8, verse 2 says, I say keep the king's command because of God's oath to him, and then be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. And what I made a point on Sunday saying that we should obey the king's command. Like, this will do well for you under the sun. Like, in general, obeying the king's command. And then also, don't run from his presence, whether that's a policeman or the actual king, because it just makes you look guilty. And so since we have a lieutenant from a certain police department nearby, Tim, can you talk to us about why that is just from sheer wisdom's sake a wise move?
Well, so I think the thing to remember as we start looking at organizations and government that, we flip over to Romans 13, what it says is that the government is the servant, right? And so when it's done incorrectly, it's scary. It can be traumatic, But when it is done correctly and when we are doing it out of the right heart motivation, then we are here to serve the neighborhoods, the communities, and everyone that is within our jurisdiction. And that's where I think it ties back in Romans 13 over in 4, where it talks about that we are God's servants. And
That's good.
that's just, in the last 20 years as I've done this, that is what I've tried to maintain in front of me, is that I don't do this to get a benefit. I don't do this because it's really cool to drive around in a car real fast in the middle of the night with lights and sirens blaring. But the reason I do this is...
But it is cool.
It is cool. But the reason I do this is to make an impact on folks. And that's been a part of our family story. Years and years ago, we were the victims of violent crime.
Oh, wow.
And so you kind of move that story ahead 20-something years, and I see the value in government, and I see the value in our first responder community and what we have the ability to do to protect the weak, the poor, the orphan, the oppressed. And that's how we serve, and that's why we serve.
Yeah. And one of the things that I brought up on Sunday is that even when, the government it's not, there's never a government that's in power that God didn't know about, right? So God is in complete control. And I think his sovereign hand, so if you didn't elect this government, or if, God forbid, another foreign power came over, attacked, won over the United States, and so now we're speaking Russian or something, that is all in God's control. So nothing is outside of God's authority. But even when, and this is the part where kind of Solomon goes, he observed all this, meaning things go wrong. Things don't go always the right way. All this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun, when man had power over man to his hurt. And one of the things I shared is that when I was in Iraq as a company commander, I was in charge of this city called Chaldea. And I kind of referred to myself as the king of Chaldea. And in any given day, I could, stop the economy. We put concertina wire all over the road, and we stopped people from working because they were supporting terrorism. And through that decision, we had one guy just get really, really seriously wounded because he blew through one of our checkpoints, and we shot him up. And I'm putting gauze around his face to keep his everything together. And so you're like, that's awful situation. Like, I'm trying to protect the city. I'm trying to sort of enforce something so terrorism isn't just like exploding all over the place, because we'd had our own soldiers get wounded, our own soldiers get killed, the children and adults of the city get killed or wounded by terrorism. And so all of a sudden I'm now implementing rules which God had sovereignly put me in charge of to do so. But then it ends up that guy gets hurt. I get a letter of concern from my brigade commander, my sergeant that did the shooting. He got suspended for a month while he was thoroughly investigated. And so nobody came out of that going, yay. That's what's difficult. And I think that's life under the sun, is that this side of heaven, you're going to experience pain even when people are trying to do the right thing. We always say that the best form of government is a benevolent dictator. It gets through all the red tape. You can get rid of the bureaucracy. Things happen at lightning speed. The problem with that is that there isn't a benevolent dictator. Even Solomon, who was given all the wisdom that any person could possibly have. Like, literally, he prays to God, God, give me wisdom to rule this people. God says, okay, here you go. And then I'm going to give you everything else you could ever heart's desire. So there's never a sort of a need that you might find that you have. And that actually, Solomon was unable to handle that blessing, and his heart went after women, which then created an injustice throughout the culture. To which then, that comes to our point, but if is unjust, if we find things that are wrong, how do we deal with that? And so here's a question, and I'd love for you guys all to weigh in on this. Here's the question that came up for this. This is the question. Would love for you to talk more about how to be passionate about social, political issues where other Christians will disagree. An example might be gun control, where one Christian feels strongly that the government shouldn't take away guns, while another Christian thinks that implementing gun control will reduce deaths, which is a good thing that honors God. How can each advocate for their position in a way that honors God? Does it ever honor God to leave a church because of a political stance where God's word is not explicitly clear on what is the right or wrong stance? What do you guys think about that? I love how it like leave a church. I thought that was interesting. Does it ever honor God to leave a church because of a political stance where God's word is not explicitly clear on what is the right or wrong stance? Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would love to hear your guys' feedback on that, on what you think. And Tim, I'll let these guys answer first because I really love to hear your thoughts on it. But Nicole, here's I won't call you average, like this amazing Christian woman from, you don't have theological
I'm not
training.
A pastor. I haven't
right?
been to
Yeah,
seminary.
you're
I'm coming from the point of view of
you're
the
an
people
artist.
in the. Oh yeah, I'm an artist.
I represent the people.
I represent the people.
Yeah. So tell me,
Sorry if I misrepresent anyone.
Yeah. So, how can you advocate for a position? And I think gun control is what was thrown out there, but so you don't necessarily need to take a position on that. But if you'd like to, that's fine too. How can each advocate for their position in a way that honors God? Does it ever honor God to leave a church because of a political stance where God's word is not explicitly clear on what is the right or wrong stance?
So, in short, no. I think, personally, I think that's a really petty reason to leave a church.
Yeah.
I think if that's the reason that you're using to leave, there's probably actually more
Right.
underlying
100%.
issues that are actually probably a little bit more legitimate, but you're not really exploring them or
Right.
trying to resolve them because maybe it's too hard or maybe there's some kind of conflict with someone. But I don't think that, because here, and I think at any church in general, political stances we hold with a pretty open hand.
Mhm.
Obviously our church takes a stance on things like abortion and homosexuality and stuff like that. But you don't necessarily have to completely agree with us to be a member or be a part of our church.
Well, or we don't take a position on certain things. Like gun control is one that
Right,
we
like
don't
gun
take a
control, we
position
don't
on
take a
because
position on that.
there doesn't seem there's I don't know.
It's not explicitly stated in the Bible.
Or
no one
sword
should own
control,
guns.
or
Right.
I don't know. It's where you could go let's go find the Bible verse where Jesus said, "Hey, you guys got any swords? I need one, so I can be numbered with the transgressors." So it's a weird thing to.
Yeah.
And maybe the person just threw out gun control because that's the thing that's
that's
a hot topic.
That's a really hot topic right now, and
Right.
so I definitely understand that. And
So what's wild about that, and I don't know if you guys know this, so and maybe Tim can speak to this, is I guess what is it, Saturday night? Was it Saturday night when the Allen shooting happened? So there's a shooting in Allen where 9 people total died. I think 7 were pretty wounded, and that happened in Allen, Texas. And I think in McAllen, Texas, down on the border, or somewhere on the border, somewhere south, is a guy intentionally drove his car into a bus stop and killed 8 people. All right, so
Wow.
And again, and so this is the question: both things can be used to kill people. Now you look at, and you could say, well, we should get rid of all cars, we should get rid of all guns because all those things are used to kill people, and
Yeah.
so the argument from gun control advocates would be, no, cars are only used to kill people this much. Guns are used to kill people this much, and their accessibility and their ability and blah, 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 blah is so much greater. Whereas non-gun control, or rather, I guess, gun freedom advocates would say, no, that people need to have a right to defend themselves, and the only people that would turn in their guns are the people that are law-abiding. So I think that's where those conversations go. And
Right.
for us as a church, we call that a tertiary issue, where
Yeah.
we agree to not have an opinion. We agree to have an opinion, and we can agree to disagree on those issues
Right.
because of whatever that issue is. But I would love, James, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I would say that is it your main passion, right? Is it your primary passion for a tertiary issue? Because that can become problematic when
So are
you're...
you guys going to carry weapons on your holsters in Taylor?
No, but some will, right? So we're not going to be advocating
You're
for
not gonna
that
have an
to
enforcement
be
clause
the
for
Wild
your
West of
Yeah.
Taylor.
Yeah.
Which we're east anyway, so we're not going to be the Wild
Wild
East
East.
over there.
Yeah, you guys are east.
But if you're bringing a tertiary issue up to the forefront and you're butting heads with everybody everywhere you go, you're probably bound to leave that place angrily anyways, because other people aren't getting on your soapbox with you.
Right, because I think what would happen is you'd have to find a church that made a tertiary issue at least a secondary issue, and a secondary issue is where like a church has a stance on this and the leadership are all in agreement and you're allowed to be here as long as you don't make a fuss about it. Whereas a tertiary stance says, hey, let's have good Christian debate on that.
I think having it open like that is God honoring though, when the Bible doesn't say anything specific about it.
Right.
And like making it something more than that would not be God honoring, because at that point you're saying something really specific about people's lives, and there's a level of control that feels like it kind of comes into play there. And
it gets a little culty,
really,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's. Do you know anything about that?
A little bit.
All right, Tim. What are your thoughts on that? Just as a guy that's been an elder, as a guy that's going to be leading Taylor Bible Church, like what's your thought on? You don't necessarily need to go into gun control if you don't want to, but like issues that are, I guess, not explicitly directed into the Bible. Like how should someone approach, especially if you feel vigorously about the implementation into culture will better culture as a whole?
So I think, zooming out on that topic, the thing that comes to mind is this something that's a personal conviction or is this a biblical commandment? And if we can identify where that thing falls, then that begins to dictate what is the response.
Right. Good.
Because if it's a biblical commandment, like this is God's word. And so as you guys were talking, I was flipping through. So Romans 14, Paul is actually talking about food here.
Yep.
But what he says is, so then we must pursue what promotes peace and what builds up one another. Do not tear down God's work because of food. Everything is clean, but it is wrong for a man to cause stumbling by what he eats.
Right.
Is it a noble thing not to eat meat or drink wine or anything that makes your brother stumble? Do you have a conviction? Keep it to yourself before God, and the man does not condemn himself by what he approves and is blessed.
Right.
And so, there's so many things that this falls into. Is it okay to go take your kids to watch rated R movies? Is it okay to listen to hard rock music?
Right.
The Bible speaks to some of these things as principles, but when you really get down at the granular level, then those become personal convictions.
Yeah, and so I always felt that legalism is when I take my personal conviction and I make them a commandment for all.
Yes.
And I think that's what the Pharisees did. Because I really think a lot of the stuff the Pharisees did were great for a personal conviction. It's just that when I take my personal conviction and I put it on you as a commandment and you don't have the conviction I have, it's going to feel like you've lost all your freedom. And that, I feel like, is what this is what, whenever there's a Christian majority, and we don't have that here in Austin, so you don't necessarily feel this, but whenever there's a Christian majority, I feel like if you're on if you're on the left, or if you are a person who is not a Christian, you feel a unbelievable pressure to be LGBTQIA affirming. Like if you are not, you are like even if you're like, does it make sense for kids to have, puberty blockers and without their parents' consent? If you were to question that, there is like the conviction of the LGBTQIA would say, no, that's a commandment. Everybody, you either get on board with that or you are a bigot. And I think that's the struggle. And I think when that's the majority right now, people would say kind of like that view. And so that's from social media, from media as a whole, that's just conveyed. And so you either get on board or get out. And I think what happened for Christians, 20, 30, maybe 40 years ago, is that there was a personal conviction that, you better go through shepherding a child's heart, or you better, kind of take, don't ever go see a rated R movie. And all these convictions became commandments. And then it sort of caused people to rebel against that and throw it away, which is why I feel like we're really set up for a huge revival. This is a complete aside, because of the way that the culture has created commandments for people that it's going to be so constricting and they're going to rebel against them. Mm-hmm. That's just another aside. So yeah, I love what Tim brought up. He's going to Romans 14 saying like, listen, what my conviction is, I'm going to keep silent between me and before God. Unless, here's the problem. What happens when there is a place where, and this might where you go from tertiary issue to secondary issue, where it does become, like for example, let's just use eating and drinking. Like someone might find alcohol offensive, but you find that part of your freedom. And so what do you do in that circumstance of like, do you then say, you may not bring it up, but someone says, you don't drink, do you? And then do you own that in that moment of like, how, you don't want to lie, but like, how does that, because what people might say is like, your freedom is causing that person to stumble. So if they know that you've ever drank, or if they feel like it's okay for you to drink alcohol in any circumstance, they're gonna stumble and fall. So I think there's some areas here where the public discourse comes in, because some of these things are public. If someone sees you having a glass of wine at dinner at whatever restaurant, does that mean you never go out to dinner and have a glass of wine ever again? Well, I think that's the struggle that I get faced with a lot of times with people asking. What do you think about that, Tim, when you're sort of wrestling with how to deal with someone's conviction and they see it's different from mine and it's in a public space? Put you on the spot. This is a great test right here for you.
Yeah. So one of the things that comes to mind as, and this is linked to that first argument, or the first thought, as we're getting to this, is the beauty of the church.
Yeah.
And this is going to be the beauty, after we leave the earth and we're all in heaven together, is the diversity within the body. Mm-hmm. And that diversity also includes that we do not think the same thing about the same topics.
Right.
And this is when we group together, as humans are apt to do, we group with people who think like us, who look like us, who talk like us. Mm. What we miss when we do that is the beauty of what's different, but yet we all follow the same Jesus and we all have a relationship with God because of Jesus and nothing that we have done.
Right.
So when our communities and when our churches all look like us, talk like us, and think like us, then we miss part of that challenge of having conversations of, is this a personal conviction or is this a biblical commandment? Okay, this is a personal conviction. Why is it a personal conviction? Is this something that I grew up with? Was this something I was taught? Was this something that I experienced? And so I've overlaid that with what I believe faith is. And so you take this like the drinking conversation, for many of us who grew up out in conservative rural West Texas, mm-hmm. I mean, not drinking was, it was up there with the authority of the Bible.
Right.
And it was something traditionally that had just been brought into the cultures in which we grew up.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so then when you begin to explore the word yourself and you begin to read yourself, you look through here and you see, well, that's not necessarily true, but what is true is Paul asks us to submit to one another, mm-hmm. that mutual submission piece. So if I love my brother, if I love my sister, and I know that they're in recovery for whatever that thing is, whether it's alcohol or drugs mm-hmm. or sex or pornography or control shopping issues, I mean, you name it, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. If I love my brother, if I love my sister, then that freedom that I have for that thing is that freedom that I lay down.
Yeah, right.
And I serve my brother, I serve my sister. I love them well by not doing that in front of them and not causing them to be a stumbling block.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, where we saw this play out probably the most was with COVID, right? This is where it was wild. Mm-hmm. You had the mask people and the anti-mask people, mm-hmm. and clearly not in the Bible, right?
True.
Yeah.
And which one was the weaker brother? That was the big question. And so that was one that a lot of people did leave the church over. It's like, how dare you guys not force people to wear masks?
Yeah.
And I am offended by that. Mm-hmm. And I think on that particular case is where it almost became irreconcilable, even though it shouldn't have been. And now looking back, people go, that was such a weird thing to be that offended by. Yeah. But clearly it did, even though there were no epidemiologists that could fully agree on anything other than it was wild. It was a wild time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so, you were too extreme either way.
Yeah.
And you lost some people, and they're not coming back.
Well, if you were moderate in any way, you lost the people who were extreme.
Right.
So there was no winning. There was no winning on that one. And so I think that's where at some point I feel like, because drinking could go down this road, right? I feel like if it's such a personal conviction for you that if people are not on board with you, then you're out, then you probably do better to leave that church because you're always going to be in angst. But the problem is, what church are you going to go to?
Well,
Right.
I think there's also a level of pride that's involved in that.
100%.
Like your personal conviction is more superior than to someone else's personal conviction.
Yeah.
You know, it's just like
And I think it's hard because you've just elevated something that's non-salvific to a, like, this is going to be a point of contention. Anyway, and so we are called to live at peace with one another.
We are.
With as much as up to you, live at peace with one another. And so at some point, if you can't get over that, then probably the best thing for you to do is to remove yourself from that community. But honestly, and this is where it gets weird, if you don't have depth of relationship, then you're probably going to just, I want to leave that community that doesn't have the same depth of relationship.
yeah.
Does that make sense? And
Yeah.
so you're just gonna, you're never gonna go deep. You're always gonna be surface level because you're just waiting to be offended by something. And that's hard. I think that's super hard. So I don't know if that fully answers that question, but I think it's at least a start on the conversation. That I think like making a tertiary issue primary is a mistake.
Yeah.
Back to what I was talking about though on this particular Sunday, it said even God allows injustice to happen under the sun. And that was talking about like even death and random shootings, or when I was in Iraq, this is one story that didn't get put out there because that shooting in Allen had just happened, is that I came across a pickup truck full of men who had been executed at point blank range, just like bullet wound right in the head. That's how they've been killed. And so I arrested everybody, took them back to our FOB, forward operating base. And we found out that the two men we arrested were actually the brothers of the guys in the back of the truck, and they had been executed for helping coalition forces in preventing terrorism. And we're like, oh my gosh, it's so awful. How'd this happen? It was just awful. Like you see that kind of stuff and you're like, why? If God allows that, like someone who is trying to prevent death, trying to prevent women and children from getting wounded or hurt, trying to help innocent people, they get executed for that. That's one of the stuff that makes you go, I don't know if I can get on board with God anymore, right? Like as usual, and the point I was making, and I'd love for you guys to speak into this, is, and probably Tim, you see this a lot, but whenever you see evil, because here's what people say, like, if I see that kind of awful things, if God will allow that, I'm not going to believe in God anymore. And the problem with that argument is at least if there is a God, there's someone to complain to. You can say like, clearly you messed this up. You need to make it right. Do your job. You can kind of go down that road. But if what you're saying is because this awful thing happened, there cannot be a God, then the thing that happened cannot be bad. Meaning it just is. There is no good. There is no bad. Everything that happens just is. But I feel like we understand a universal sense of complete evil. So that must mean there has to be a good in the opposite side of that we can all recognize. That's a morally objective good that everybody should understand.
That's good.
So I feel like that's a struggle we have. And I would love to kind of hear from your perspective, Tim, just from being a police officer, seeing that for so many years, like, and maybe you can talk into your own story of like, when you see evil, does that ever make you go, oh, there is no God? Or how's a person deal with that?
Thinking back over many assignments that I've had, as far as, working the street as a patrol officer, also at one point was in the family violence and child abuse unit.
Wow.
So you get to see some pretty horrific things that people will do to one another. I took that, and this was just my personal approach, I took that as kind of the catalyst for this is why I am here. So that piece that I talked about earlier, to be there for the poor, the oppressed, the orphan, the weak.
Yeah.
Like this is exactly why God has placed us in this space at this time, was to be the voice, to be the shield, to be the good into the situation where there may not be any other good. And I agree with you that if evil exists, then good has to exist.
Right.
Like those two cannot exist in a vacuum.
Right.
And so we are not good, but God is good. And God has placed us at this time. He's planted us here, and he has gifted us uniquely in order to move the kingdom into these dark places. And so have there been times when I saw something that was really horrific and got angry? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And in those times, I kind of identified with some of the characters of the Bible where, the Lord like stirred up this anger, like this righteous, like we're going to fix this and we're going to solve this and we're going to hold somebody accountable for these actions. And I'm going to be a part of this team that does that.
Yeah, I love that.
And so that's how I approached it. But it can be very difficult to shepherd people through seeing difficult things where innocent people who were minding their own business, something happened to them, and then trying to explain, where is God in this situation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like this was, for me, the concept without there being a God, there is no judgment for anything. Or even if there's like a watchmaker God who sets all in motion, when you die, you die. Like, without the concept of eternity, you cannot, your brain's going to explode with the amount of injustice. Mm-hmm. Like Buddha, I don't know if you guys, like, was it Siddhartha or whatever his name was, like before he was Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. Like, he was, there was a prophecy over his life that once he saw like the injustice of the world, he'd become a monk. So his dad, as a king, shielded him from all sorts of stuff. And then one day he's like, Dad, you gotta let me out of these walls. He's going, stir crazy. And so he parades through the streets and they have a great parade and he doesn't see anything bad. He's like, that's amazing. I need to go out more often. And the dad's like, no, you can only go out with an escort with only and so he goes out one day and he sees a sick man and he just doesn't understand sickness. He goes out and sees an old man, and then he goes out and sees like a dead man, and then his whole world gets wrecked by it. And that's when how he becomes enlightened to become the Buddha, which is like to feel nothing. When you reach this place of nirvana where you're completely like, free from the body and its decay, then you're no longer susceptible to the reincarnation cycle. I know that's probably way more Buddha stuff than you need to know. But I love that, because what happens is, if there is no eternity, if there is no judgment, then you are going to lose your mind and you're going to create something in your head to sort of, you're going to create some religion. I think that's what Buddha did, is he created, I'm going to achieve nothingness, a complete separation from my body. The Greek philosophy was that your body was evil and it was preventing you from doing good things. But once Gnosticism, once I die and achieve like greater, the force or whatever, like that was sort of like body evil, spirit good. Aristotle, Plato, those guys. And so I think you've got like this reality that we are basically struggling because we see so much evil and darkness that when you encounter God who does judge, that's the thing that allows you to have freedom. And then the scary part of that, James, this is probably where I'd love you to speak into. What that means is, if God will judge every secret thing, that means people are now liable and nobody wants to be liable. You want to speak into that, just as from your perspective?
Yeah, I would say first, if anyone's like, God, would you just wipe out all the evil? We're gone.
Yeah, then
right?
You're included in that.
We're included in that, and none of us are blameless. And so recognizing first that we have this sin problem, that each of us, we've got it inside of us. That same reason for this decay that we see all around us, it is in us, and we're perpetuating that, and we're not as good as we think.
Right.
And so as we recognize how guilty we are, God's grace grows even more for us, because we're able to recognize how good he is to rescue us out of that and to provide a solution for us in the person and work of Jesus Christ and what he did for us on the cross.
You need Jesus, and that's what we talked about, is like, Jesus is the answer. He who knew no sin became sin on your behalf, that you might be the righteousness of God. And so you need that. All right, last question. Is Solomon describing what those who only live life only under the sun without God should do in Ecclesiastes 9:7 and through chapter 10? It seemed more like an exhortation, take pleasure in what God has given and be joyful. And I'm going to give you the answer that's very political in this sense: yes and no. I think what is going on here is at least all the way through Ecclesiastes, Solomon does speak as the wisest person ever that God gave wisdom to in one sense, and then in another sense, he says stuff that you're like, that can't be true. So, for example, he's like, enjoy your life with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life. Because your life isn't meaningless. God, if there is a God, it has instituted great meaning. So go eat your bread, drink your wine, have a merry heart, for God has already proved what you do. If you are living life under the sun, you already have approval to do whatever, because there is no God to say yes or no. So go for it. I do think. For whatever your hand finds to do with all your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going. And that is a non-Christian perspective of Sheol. Now, if there's, in the Old Testament, this is just a fun fact, Sheol and Abaddon are two places for the place of the dead. Sheol is like a wandering soul place where there is no thought and souls are just kind of like mixing around, and it's, it's an odd place. And Abaddon's like where you're getting tortured to death.
Yeah.
And there, you don't really hear about Abraham's bosom up until, Luke, where you've got Lazarus, who's the beggar, and the rich man, right? So what you're looking at here is, I feel like it's the perspective of life under the sun. And then chapter 10 is very proverbial. Here's some general principles of the way the life works. Whether there is a God or not a God doesn't really matter. But ultimately, he's going to point you to the fact that if you live life proverbially, you'll be successful. But, and I mean by proverbially, I mean by following general principles that God has laid out, that will be very successful for you. That wisdom is the same anywhere, Eastern context, Western context, be wise. But you can't depend on a principle to save you. You need a promise. And that's where Jesus comes in. And I think that's what Solomon is leaving you with, is that the only promise you have is that God is in control. So fear God. And that's why chapter 12 gets us to this very last thought, the very last line. Or the end of the matter, all has been heard. That's verse 13. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. So that would go in contrast to like nobody knows anything in Sheol, right? Because how are you going to have judgment and have eternal life if eternity is also in the hearts of man? I think that's Ecclesiastes 3. Like that's the part, that's the part where we're watching God is doing something. And so Solomon is wrestling with this all the way through, and he's got his critic mindset on, where he's like sort of criticizing people for when they look at life and they sacrifice a lot, joy, happiness to get something else, whatever it is, whatever they get doesn't matter because that's not an eternal thing. And so what he's saying is like the thing that's eternal is fearing God, because he's going to judge every secret thing, whether good or bad. And that's where you go to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where we're all going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ, and he will judge every word and deed. Okay. So hopefully that helps. And I do need to land the plane because this podcast is about to go a little long. All right, hey, listen, thank you guys so much for joining us on today's podcast. If you got any questions, just text us in at 737-231-0605 or go to pastorplek.com. We would love to talk faith, culture, and everything in between. And if you're a person like that is on YouTube or on wherever you're listening or watching this podcast, make sure you like, subscribe, share, do all the things you're supposed to do so that we can get this out to as many people as possible. If this has affected you for your good, we would love for you to share it. So from our house to yours, have an awesome week of worship.